Right, so I covered a story the other day where 8 BBC journalists laid into their own bosses over their pro-Israel stance, their bias, taking their story to Al Jazeera in order to do so, to ensure it was reported properly and not spun into something else, as our own media outlets would no doubt do. But equally, this has been reflected somewhat in Israel as well, with their newspaper Haaretz, who have been calling out Israeli atrocity, calling out the lies and exposing the truth. Journalists there more able to speak out freely than our own BBC, as it would appear. But appearances can be deceptive, as the Netanyahu regime is so unhappy that all of their lies are getting undone by one of their own newspapers, and they are invoking patriotism as the reasons why. Haaretz is being called unpatriotic by calling out what they're doing, but given that Haaretz is actually older than the state of Israel itself, can that even be an accusation that holds water? But besides which, governments should be held to account by their media. That's what a free and fearless press is all about, is it not? The fact this shutdown of Israel's longest running newspaper, or sanctions against it, appears to have legs to it, shows that Netanyahu and his regime have plenty to hide, and Haaretz exposing it is making them decidedly uncomfortable. Right, so Haaretz. I've used this newspaper as a source material in several of my recent videos on the ongoing atrocities out there, because it is credible. It does not bullshit like our media does, and just as Al Jazeera have been doing a sterling job of exposing what is going on between Israel and Gaza from outside the involved territories. But Haaretz has been doing so from within. But that might be coming with a cost from their own government, who really don't like being held to account. They just are not used to it, you see. Now, the Israeli government is the most hard-right regime we've possibly ever seen in Israel. Netanyahu having done deals with far-right extremist parties to cobble together a coalition to stay in power and carry on as he has been. He's facing both his final permanent ousting from power as more and more Israelis stand against him, not to mention the news and Israel action being exposed day after day, week after week, and the propaganda alongside them gets shredded. And Haaretz has played no small part in that. They are a lefty liberal publication, so well to the left of Netanyahu, and have been in existence since 1918, which is longer than Israel's been around. But certainly making it the longest running Israeli publication in existence, and has the third largest newspaper circulation in Israel, behind the pro-Netanyahu free paper Israel Hayom and the tabloid Yedioth Arnaroth, I probably pronounced them horribly wrong, which is considered anti-Netanyahu, but only because it favours another right-winger, Zippy Livni, who was previously wanted for international arrest, no less, in connection with war crimes, which infamously, the Tory government of David Cameron bent the rules over to permit her to visit the UK in 2011, and they lent on the then Director of Public Prosecutions to not issue an arrest warrant for her, which of course he went along with, following the Tories has become a career move of his, because it was of course at that time a certain Keir Starmer. Anyway, Haaretz is clearly the biggest non-brutal occupation anti-apartheid printed paper in Israel, and it is also produced in both Hebrew and English, which makes it more accessible to the rest of the world too, especially here in the West. To emphasise those anti-apartheid credentials and show why Netanyahu is really at the end of his rope with this paper, this is what senior journalist at the paper Gideon Levy said of his own country recently in relation to Palestine. He said, "I'm an Israeli. I was born in Israel. I even perceive myself as an Israeli patriot. I care about Israel. I belong in Israel. I'm attached to Israel. Don't speak about symmetria, because there is no symmetry. I would even suggest there is no conflict. Was there a French-Algerian conflict? There was a brutal French occupation in Algeria which came to its end, and there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is a brutal Israeli occupation which must come to an end one way or another. In our backyard there is a regime which is today by far one of the most cruel, brutal tyrannies on earth, and I know what I say because I've covered it for 40 years. And this regime cannot be defined but as an apartheid. Two peoples live on one piece of land. One people has all the rights in the world, and I am talking now only about the occupied territories. One people has all the rights in the world, the other people have no rights whatsoever. It looks like an apartheid, it talks like an apartheid, it is an apartheid, and nobody can contradict it." It's a powerful speech he gave, and you can see why Netanyahu might not be very keen on Haaretz, but I thought it interesting he defines himself as a patriot too, and as such, calling out his own country for wrongdoing instead of turning a blind eye or encouraging more of it is how he chooses to demonstrate his love for his country, because he can see what it is doing. He knows it is wrong. The whole world can see it is wrong. And it's an embarrassment to world leaders across the globe who are saying otherwise, who deny that Israel is an apartheid state, and that it is a magnifying glass both Sunak and Starmer here are guilty of being firmly under. The final straw for Netanyahu, and it's quite understandable from his warped perspective, is that Haaretz exposed to the world the involvement of the IDF in the killings of large numbers of people at the Nova Music Festival and in the nearby kibbutzes, such as Be'eri kibbutz, where footage of an Apache helicopter, US made of course, gunning down people who were clearly at the music festival and then later killing anyone who tried to leave the kibbutzes, another Hannibal directive to prevent hostages being taken, presumably, that it wasn't all Hamas doing all of the killing. In fact, the music festival was an event Hamas weren't apparently aware of and screwed their plans up, in fact. Ultimately, it was these events, solely blamed on Hamas at the time as they were, which have been the justification for Israel to carry out all of the attacks on Gaza ever since, driving people south and killing or wounding more than 50,000 people to date. One of their own newspapers exposing their own part in killing those people, their own people. Well, that's awkward, isn't it? Well, following that, Israeli communications minister has now sought to place sanctions on Haaretz, basically, for being unpatriotic, as they say. A very different version of patriotism, clearly, to that of Gideon Levy. Patriotism to this Israeli government is to do what it likes, kill and maim and mistreat with impunity, behave every bit like the occupying apartheid state that they are, shielded by their friends in the West, too many of them, as we are now well aware of, dumbed down by too many in the media, but those outlets that can get the real news out there, harnessing the power of social media to do so. Well, things have changed now. People aren't buying into it. If you clamp down and sanction Haaretz, if you try to close them down, it will only be seen for the mercenary Zionist doctrine you follow being followed, and the apartheid that goes hand in hand with it, and it will not change minds or attitudes, which are hardening against Israel. And with a ceasefire currently supposedly in place, questionable when Israel broke it within an hour, any further acts to clamp down on free speech will be seen as a big right-wing baby throwing its toys out of the pram, because finally some accountability is being applied. But it will nowhere near be enough until Netanyahu and those in his ministry, and those formerly in his ministries, such as the aforementioned Zippy Livni, have their day in The Hague, on trial for war crimes they are sorely overdue being held accountable for. Media outlets like Haaretz are a rare source of truth for what is happening in Gaza right now and what Israel is actually doing rather than what they claim to be doing, because there's a gulf of difference. Sanctioning them for holding you to account is not going to go well for you, BB. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where the kind of thing Israel does want promoted is their kids singing for more genocide, apparently. I remember singing hymns as a kid. I thought having to do that was bad enough. This is much worse. But again, systematic of the way Israel is run by appalling people, an apartheid state that celebrates the fact as long as they don't get criticised for it. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, 4 days from Friday the 24th of November through until Monday the 27th, was broken within an hour by the IDF, as Palestinians waving white flags, believing the ceasefire had begun, rightfully, came out of hiding only to be shot at, with 2 people being killed. A reprehensible act for which Israel needs to be held to account over. But of course Keir Starmer said a ceasefire would embolden Hamas, didn't he? Not the IDF. Hamas have thus far followed the terms of the ceasefire, even delayed the release of a second batch of hostages until Israel behaved themselves and did likewise. Not a sign that Starmer is backing the right side here, but why did Israel think they could get away with breaching the terms of the ceasefire? Why did they do so at all? And what are Gazans actually doing right now if they aren't all Hamas and being emboldened, as Keir Starmer said they would be? Right, so we're on day 3 of the ceasefire between Israel and Palestine. The hope that this would turn into something longer and more meaningful, however, has been shaken. Not by Hamas, though, but by Israel, who chose to shoot at white flag waving Palestinians coming out of hiding who decided to try and return to their homes. That was why Israel broke the ceasefire within an hour, because they didn't want that happening. If the Gazans had headed southwards like Israel wanted them to, or demanding they do, still itself a war crime, it is forced displacement after all, then they probably wouldn't have been shot at. Not that that excuses the ceasefire being breached by Israel anyway. Israel do not want Gazans heading north. We know this. The order to evacuate and move south was not only illegal, but also ridiculous, and not without Israel still targeting people moving south whilst they were at it. Convoys hit and more people killed. Every target in Gaza City in the north, where the people have been told to leave, has been attacked, haven't they? Hospitals, schools, refugee camps, people's homes, all attacked and blown up and bombed, all in the name of driving out and targeting Hamas. The IDF planting evidence along the way. It's blatant, and we shouldn't shy away from saying that now. Planting evidence. I mean, weapons caches behind big magnets in MRI machines. Come off it. And in schools as well. Tunnels that turned out to be water tanks under hospitals. Enough of it. Their excuses are insulting, but equally, forcing people to move south was never going to expose Hamas either. Israel makes so much of Hamas hiding behind civilians as their excuse to kill lots of Gazan civilians, to excuse their actions, but they'll have headed south as well, won't they, Hamas? And presumably that's why Israel have carried on targeting people in the south of Gaza as well. But back to the here and now. Gazans coming out of hiding, of believing a ceasefire is in place. Well, they just wanted to go home. Why, if things are over, or so they hope? Why, if we're hoping things are going to become more permanent and peaceful, are they not allowed to head back towards Gaza City? Why did the IDF shoot at them, even under ceasefire terms? Because that's what they were doing. The only reasonable explanation is that Israel had no intention of letting these people ever return north. I've said from the beginning of all of this that this is a land grab in the making. Israel, figuring their loyal, bought and paid for friends in the West will cover for them, as usual, as they commit genocide and seize more land for settlers. Force the Gazans out into the Sinai, take the Gaza Strip that they've occupied for decades anyway, and just make it part of Israel. Then they can concentrate on the West Bank next, and presumably the Golan Heights they stole from Syria as well. This event got picked up here by Sky News, surprisingly, explaining why these people were moving north, because it wasn't all about just going home for the sake of going home. So many homes have been reduced to rubble as a result of the bombing, but of course there are many people in the north who couldn't leave. Families got split up. This was about trying to reunite with them, possibly at refugee camps like Jabalia, possibly because they were patients or worked at the various hospitals that had been targeted, unable to move south, and medical staff refusing to abandon people who couldn't move. A Sky News cameraman on the scene was able to get audio out saying that as these crowds of men, but also women and children, came out, there was direct shooting towards the crowd and into the crowd. He spoke of witnessing people being shot. At least 2 were killed, and he himself narrowly escaped being shot whilst he was filming, again showing the disregard Israel have for the press team. Israel later admitted they will shoot anyone who tries to return to Gaza City, and that's why the ceasefire was broken. That needs explaining further, because there sure as hell is no justifying that. Of course, when there is next to no international scrutiny, they can happily admit such things, because they are so used to getting away with it every time after all. Sky later interviewed Netanyahu mouthpiece and former UK-Israeli ambassador Mark Regev about this, because, let's face it, he's always available, isn't he? And he said Hamas were forcing these people to move, and so that's why they got shot. There was a ceasefire in place, dumbass, and actually Hamas have respected it, even held Israel to account over it. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's digress from the ceasefire breaches of Israel for a moment, though, because if we fixate on that, you could be forgiven for thinking that no good has come from this ceasefire. Hostages held by both sides have been released. The numbers that I picked up on this morning, they varied from media outlet to media outlet, depending on which one you ask. But basically, 50 Israeli hostages held by Hamas and 150 Palestinian hostages held by Israel have been released, or are in the process of being released. And yes, they were hostages, not prisoners, as the media insist on referring to them. They consisted of women and children, mostly convicted of nothing. So if they haven't been convicted of anything, they aren't prisoners, are they? They're hostages. Why are you holding them otherwise? Of those alleged to have committed crimes, including kids, the crime committed was throwing stones. Let's not forget that Israel's demented defence minister Bezalel Smotrich has instigated a shoot-to-kill policy in response to stone throwing now. So I suppose these kids are the lucky ones, and that at least they still breathe. They got incarcerated instead of getting killed. Or at least that's the case for now anyway. You don't live to get old in Gaza. That's why half the population are under 18 after all. Israel has some 2,000 Palestinians in detention, i.e. hostages. They call it administrative detention, and under this they can lock anyone up for however long they like. They don't have to provide a shred of evidence justifying it, and don't even need to tell the person who is being locked up why they are being locked up. But sure, go on, tell me this isn't an apartheid state. Well, Israel have released 150-ish of their hostages, but before doing so, they sent the IDF around to the homes of their families to warn them against celebrating publicly, because they might place them back in administrative detention, presumably, if they dare show any glad tidings and emotion. Of course, our media are full of images of Israeli hostages being reunited with their families, and that's great. They're allowed to show that. They're allowed to show the tears of joy there. But why should Israel get away with clamping down on Palestinians being allowed to do likewise? All of this ultimately adds up to this ceasefire not really being a ceasefire, because there's no sign that Israel are prepared to lay down their arms and pull out of Gaza. Not if they are killing people attempting to return north. This is the reality of the humanitarian pause. This is what Starmer wanted, and still people are dying. Starmer said Hamas would be emboldened by a ceasefire, but Israel have been emboldened during this pause. It isn't even humanitarian when people are still being killed, and the world still won't call it out. What are Gazans doing during this ceasefire then? Are they getting emboldened? No. You want to know what they're doing? Well, they're burying their dead. Now they finally have a chance to do so without getting killed themselves. The bodies haven't been left out for so long. Disease is now spreading amongst these people as decay sets in. Families are trying to reunite with each other. Injured people able to finally leave are using this time to do so. Families are surveying the damage to their homes and property into their lives, and these are the people Keir Starmer fears a ceasefire will encourage violence amongst. The man is twisted. He'll never hold Israel to account. He owes the lobby too much. I mentioned Hamas holding Israel accountable for their actions a moment ago. There's a really good example of this happening in practice, and it just goes to show how unused Israel are at having to deal with Hamas on a level playing field, looking at them in the eye, so to speak. The second group of hostages that Hamas were due to release has been delayed because of Israeli breaches to the ceasefire, and they listed all the reasons justifying their actions in this, which all involve multiple further breaches of the ceasefire agreement by Israel. First, they highlighted that example of the two Palestinians being killed trying to return to Gaza City. Apparently one was injured and bleeding on the floor, but people were prevented from reaching them because they get shot at. The agreement said that women and children would be selected for release by Israel based on how long they had been held for. Israel didn't do that. The IDF visiting families to stop them celebrating was considered a breach of the ceasefire agreement as well. Israel had no right to do that. Along with Palestinians on foot being denied the freedom to return north, so were aid trucks heading the same way. Israel also breached the no-fly zone on day one of the ceasefire. And despite Hamas hostages having been treated well, Israel evidently did not show the same courtesy. In point of fact, Hamas have observed the terms of the ceasefire completely, and Israel blatantly haven't. Israel have a history of not observing ceasefires because they get away with it, because the world always turns a blind eye to them. Well, the world isn't doing that now anymore, and leaders continuing to do so will suffer for it as people are better informed than they'd like us to be. A proper, meaningful ceasefire will not embolden Hamas. They have shown themselves now, as they have in the past, to be compliant in ceasefires. That isn't excusing what they've done, but you can't excuse what Israel has done either and is still doing by not complying itself. It is Israel that becomes emboldened by not being held to account, and if the world would stop giving them a free pass all the time, we might actually get somewhere in the Middle East. That definitely includes those self-declared Zionists without qualification like Keir Starmer. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did more content out daily. Please do have your say on this video in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where Keir Starmer has been jumping through hoops, flip-flopping over his actual ceasefire position as he finds himself increasingly on the wrong side of history, as per usual. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the BBC have had an absolute car crash, falling over itself once more to dishonestly present the news, it would appear, because their claims of errors are once again falling on deaf ears to those people who are more than familiar with how they choose to frame narratives and influence how people think in the way that they present the news. As we know, hostages are being released by both Israel and Hamas as we go into the final day of the 4-day ceasefire. Hope that it'll be extended, looking a little bit ropey, maybe, given the conduct of Israel not sticking to the ceasefire agreement in multiple examples, as stated in my earlier video. And yesterday I covered what the Israeli government is looking to do to one of its own media outlets who are reporting honestly, showing the BBC up not only for how it covers the same news concerning hostage releases and the conduct of Israel and Hamas and the impact on innocent Gazans, but doubly so since it is standing up to its own government over that, something the BBC appears utterly incapable of. But given the Tories have stuffed it full of their own, that should come as little surprise. I suppose the dishonesty of the BBC being run by Tories in Tory interests and following a Tory news narrative therefore shouldn't surprise us at all, but equally it shouldn't surprise them when we see it and it gets called out to embarrassing effect on their part. Right, so what have the BBC done this time, Damo? Well, we're talking Israeli hostage releases here. Those Palestinians being released are reporting that they have not been treated well, been abused, all things that Israel really don't want the world to hear. And certainly our own pro-Israel Tory government don't want us hearing either. So the BBC, required to cover this story as they are, covered it in the way they so often do, by setting a narrative, presenting the story in a certain light, a certain way, so as to influence how we are viewing the conflict, not necessarily just reporting the news as it actually is. They got away with it for years, but in this era of social media, it doesn't cut through anymore because we can get our news from so many different sources, or reliable sources, impartial, foreign-based sources even sources located in the same part of the world. And when they're saying different, it raises questions as to who to believe, and with the BBC's reputation for newsworthiness as it stands these days, it's not difficult to see why more and more people are turning it off, especially in case of Israel and the Palestine crisis. Sources like Israel-based Haaretz or Qatar-based Al Jazeera have proven vastly more reliable. But the latest example of BBC shamelessness came in the wake of an interview with a freed Palestinian hostage called Sarah al-Suwaisa. She does not speak English, therefore a translation was required, and this was subtitled. And this is where the BBC came a cropper, because this is what she said, according to the BBC translation. The Israelis came at 10 in the morning and told us there was a deal. We were suffering from difficult circumstances and tear gas was fired at us. We were wearing head covers all the time. The situation was humiliating and included psychological torture. In addition to cutting off the electricity for the prisoners, we were suffering from the cold without electricity, and no one helped us. Only Hamas cared. Those who felt our suffering. I thank them very much, and we love them very much. So a mistreated hostage who happens to also be a very big fan of Hamas, it would appear. She said they felt her suffering. Only they cared. She thanked them and said that she loves them. So no fewer than 4 instances of positive expression towards Hamas from this lady then. Well, that is if you believe the BBC translation, because they of course weren't the only people to translate what she said, because the organisation Respond Crisis Translation also did so. And this is all these guys do. They are a non-profit that provide translation services globally to help migrants, refugees, anywhere there's a language barrier to accessing safety and dignity, which can be the difference ultimately between people being able to access their basic human rights that they are entitled to or not. So good translation is so important, it is key. And they have no fewer than 58 Arabic translators working for them, according to their website. I'd imagine they know their onions here then. This is what they said that Sarah al-Suwaisa said. The Israeli occupation forces came at 10 a.m. telling us there would be a deal, and then they imprisoned us. They've imprisoned us for a month. They are firing tear gas at us. We female prisoners are living under constant humiliation. We keep veiled 24/7. Nobody knows anyone. Prisoners with mental health issues are being treated mercilessly in the same way as healthy prisoners, being tortured and humiliated, leading to their collapse. Nobody helps or supports anyone. They've imprisoned us for a month. As winter came, they cut off the electricity. We almost died from the cold weather. They sprayed us with pepper spray and left us to die in the prison. You'll notice in their translation there isn't a single mention of Hamas, let alone 4 gushing responses about them. The BBC also heavily downplayed their mistreatment and also mental health. There are far too many errors for this to be an honest mistake, in my opinion. This was deliberate misrepresentation, because the average BBC viewer who cannot understand Arabic will just take the subtitles at face value. This shows you can't do that. Response Crisis Translation had plenty more to say on what they thought of the BBC's translation, though. In a thread on Twitter, their official account said, "A released Palestinian prisoner says in Arabic that Israel held them in the cold without electricity, sprayed us with pepper spray and left us to die. She never mentioned Hamas or a word like it. Yet the BBC translated to, 'No one helped us, only Hamas cared, we love them very much.' This egregious mistranslation is not just a language error, it is a racist fabrication that fans the flames of the war. The BBC must immediately correct this dangerous error and explain how it came to be. Mistranslations such as these, intentional or not, are exacerbating the ongoing genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. These wild mistranslations and other forms of rampant language violence are why Respond is partnering with journalists to fill language gaps in coverage of the Gaza genocide." Perhaps the BBC should partner with them too to get their own translations right, but given how many mistakes you can find here, it really doesn't strike me as their legitimate intent, and I think Respond are absolutely right to call out mistranslations such as these as egregious and racist. Having been caught out, though, the BBC has trotted out a correction. At time of writing, there's still no official apology, though. What they did do was pull the video saying their reason for it had been an error in the editing process, so the BBC won't even admit to its translation having been utter bullshit then. Well, the story goes even deeper. You see, the interview with Sarah Al-Suwaisa was actually a little bit longer originally, and in the slightly longer footage, it's 42 seconds long instead of the original 35 seconds, Al-Suwaisa did say she was proud of Hamas. So the BBC editing error, as they call it, could have been a fully translated interview, but by shortening the clip by a few seconds, they cut the bit off where she actually mentioned Hamas. Yet they intentionally, clearly had to have done, left that bit of the subtitles in, or rather covered up the bits mentioning some of the details of mistreatment in order to shoehorn that subtitle in. That still seems very, very deliberate to me. So for anyone horrified that her admission is true at the end of the day, I think it's a case of you need to appreciate the fact she doesn't speak for all Gazans for a start. Most are sick of Hamas rule, but equally they're under occupation. They're resisting, and it's taken an atrocity such as that which Hamas committed, though it certainly appears more deaths on October 7th were due to Israeli gunships, as we've discovered since, to get the world to notice. We can't look away again now. This has to be resolved now that we're looking again. But equally, we can't allow ourselves to become victims of a westernised misinformation campaign, courtesy of supposed news outlets that blatantly cannot be trusted. The BBC has shamed itself once more, and with no apology still, continues to do so. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content up daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where Israel is set to sanction one of their own newspapers. Even talk of shutting it down completely is circulated for telling the world, if they care to listen, exactly what Israel are doing, considering it their patriotic duty to do so. Netanyahu's goons thinking otherwise, so is treatment like this what the BBC is so afraid of at the Tories' hands? Perhaps they should focus on doing what is right for us, the people who actually fund them, and not for them, as Haaretz appear to be very much doing. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so this weekend saw another march in London, but this time it wasn't a pro-Palestinian one. It was supposedly a march against anti-Semitism. Definitely couldn't disagree with that sentiment in and of itself, but the sea of Israeli flags made us feel less about anti-Semitism and more about pushing back against the marches we've previously witnessed up and down the country for Palestine and for Gaza, and more about celebrating Israel instead. This was a show of people taking a side in what is happening in the Middle East, not so much a stance against racism. And when one of the key figures who turned up was a certain Stephen Yaxley Lennon, preferring to be known as Tommy Robinson, the former leader and founder of the English Defence League, masquerading as a journalist as it happened, it pretty much rubber stamps this as not being an anti-racist event, not an anti-Semitism march even. This was a pro-Zionist exercise, a who's who of siding with the oppressors and occupiers of Israel. Right, so I'm all for supporting the fight against anti-Semitism. The real thing, that is, of course. The genuine article. I would hope we all were, so long as all other forms of racism are treated as equally disgusting and called out wherever any of them are found. But of course we know that this isn't the case. We know anti-Semitism has been weaponised to death. It was a scam. This has harmed the fight against the real thing and has led to other forms of racism, notably Islamophobia, being treated as somehow less important. So a march against anti-Semitism in and of itself isn't something that ought to be argued against, unless it ends up once more as an exercise in weaponising the issue, and in my opinion, that is exactly what we saw in London this weekend gone, unfortunately, whether that had been the original intention or not. If it was not, then unfortunately bad faith actors have turned it into one. If it was, then shame on you all. But given that the organisers were the discredited charity Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, I'm firmly of the opinion it was the latter, especially when you consider Gideon Falter, the CEO of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, is a board member of the Jewish National Fund, which raises money to help settlers illegally settle in the Palestinian-occupied territories. It is also behind the rancid claim that the pro-Palestine marches turned London into a no-go area for Jews. Funny that, I could have sworn there were loads of them at those pro-Palestine marches. Perhaps they were just the wrong kind, though. When you go onto social media and you look at the images, it is a sea of Israeli flags. You can argue that their presence is just a nod to the Jewish faith via the Jewish state. But if you really want to stand up for human rights and against racism, then flying the flag of an occupying state embroiled in genocide of Gazan people right now, majority Muslim but not exclusively so, that might not be the best way of standing against anti-Semitism right now, eh? In fact, there were so many Israeli flags it could not be read as much more than a pro-Zionist march, whether that was the feeling of everyone who took part in that march or not. Put it this way, the BBC, whose reputation is mud on the issue of Israel and Gaza already, even they admitted that that march was as much a march in support of Israel as it was against anti-Semitism. So let's consider that point put to bed now. Who showed up to shill for Israel in that case then? Disgraced Labour MP who took a Tory peerage after destroying the safe seat of Dudley North for his party, Ian Austin, he was there. Tracy Ann Oberman was there, fresh from having attacked actor's agent James Foster on Twitter just in the last few days because somebody he didn't know replied to one of his tweets in a way that compared Israel to the Nazis, and for some reason she decided to blame Foster for that. Last time I looked, unless you lock your account, you can't stop people replying to you whether you know them or not, and you certainly have no control over what they happen to say. I would imagine she knows this by now. She's been embarrassed on the former Birdside enough times already, much like others who showed up with her, such as her sidekick Rachel Riley, alleged actor Eddie Morrison, serial Labour resigner Maureen Lipman, radio loudmouth Julia Hartley-Doodah, and her bestie that she got photographed with, Boris Johnson, because he's firmly anti-racist, of course. He's never said anything remotely racist ever, has he? And of course that infamous anti-racist campaigner and esteemed journalist Stephen Christopher Yaxley Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson, because you can't have an anti-racist march without one of the biggest racists going, apparently. Hey, that's a whole load of white people, by the way, folks. Robinson is massively pro-Israel because he's done extremely well out of pro-Israel interests, particularly the pro-settler movement, funded in part at least by a far-right organisation as it is called Elad, who are determined to ethnically cleanse Palestine in effect. They themselves are funded by an array of pro-Israeli interests. Double Down News and Low-Key have done excellent work on this, so I won't go too far down this rabbit hole. They've explored the whole Warren. Go watch their stuff on this. But several organisations with connections to Elad also have connections to Robinson. Middle East Forum are led by a former employee of the Israeli Ministry of Defence and were quoted 13 times by Norwegian mass killer Anders Breivik. They funded the Free Tommy Robinson campaign as well. Another is the Hertog Foundation, which itself funded the David Horowitz Freedom Centre, which has employed both Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson. They also fund Friends of the IDF. Yes, if you thought Labour Friends of Israel was bad, imagine being a friend of the IDF. And they are also funders of the aforementioned Middle East Forum. Friends of the IDF have on their board a guy called Robert Schulman, and he's, also funded a certain Tommy Robinson. Functionally, Robinson is up to his eyeballs in pro-Zionist funding, so let's not pretend his presence at the march was anything other than a, paid appearance in all effects, in all likelihood. Of course, where Robinson goes, he inevitably calls down the knuckle-draggers who hang on his every word. He called them out to join him on his march. Organisers at the CAA apparently begged him to stay away, but he didn't. And of course, where Robinson goes, the police inevitably get involved somewhere too. Robinson himself getting arrested, as per usual, crying his eyes out yet again, having been instructed by them as well to stay away, thus making the entire affair, the whole march, as much about him as he possibly could. And of course, it would be remiss of me to not point out a sizable Jewish contingent were present, not waving Israeli flags, but they were waving Palestinian ones. It is notable that so often these Jewish groups include members of the Jewish Orthodoxy who get abused by other Jewish groups, and with reports of them having been targeted by some of the other demonstrators, the anti-Semitic vibe of the march was distinctly lacking amongst some, clearly, when you can go on an anti-Semitism march and attack Jewish people whilst you're at it. I mean, what? Marching against racism is great and good and just, and is what every one of us normal right-thinking people would do, when it is truly that which you are marching for. And there will have been many there marching for the genuine article of that, I am sure. But when they have not been the focus, then another agenda has been at play. This march at the weekend was a stunt, organised by people who weaponised the issue, not who fight it. Too many there for Israel, who were marching for genocide instead of against racism. And I would imagine the next pro-Palestine demo in London will be even bigger as a result of this, just to hammer that point home. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation as ever. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation with the BBC. Yes, let's come back to them again. Last month they were playing down the pro-Palestine protests as if they were somehow less important, whilst also playing the anti-Semitism card as they did so. Utterly shameless conduct. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so it would seem Labour are being petulant little crybabies, to put it frankly, following a defection and a lost by-election on Newham Borough Council last week. A council which up until 2018, incidentally, they held every single seat on. But they're not taking the losses of those 2 seats last week, both to the newly minted Newham Independent group with good grace, or even taking note of the reasons they perhaps lost the seat. And you might be thinking, Damo, you're covering a lot of the goings-on in Newham right now, but what you have to realise is that what is happening there, with Labour having insulted vast swathes of its Muslim vote particularly, Newham being a very multicultural, very diverse in the religious and ethnicities of the demographic the council there represent, they created division within their strongholds, and that is a picture that will be reflected elsewhere too. How Labour react to that, therefore, says much for their electoral chances at both local and national levels going forwards. Therefore, this most recent development ought to concern Labour voters greatly, and indeed Newham Borough Council voters, as to how cohesive the council will be in its work, and how the still dominant Labour group react to having a slightly bigger opposition now, reacting in fact to their official opposition on the council as the Newham Independent group actually are now, because the statutory deputy mayor of Newham, no less, has, in what can only be described as an infantile move, just blocked the Newham Independent group's official account on Twitter. Why should this matter nationally though, Damo? How does this send a message to voters up and down the country? Well, watch on, and I'll tell you. Right, so the Newham Independent group with 3 councillors on Newham Borough Council are now the official opposition, outnumbering, as they do, the 2 Green Party councillors there. And it seems there's some very bad blood amongst the remaining Labour councillors towards them, or at least amongst some of them. So before I get on to this key Labour figure blocking the Newham Independents, here's an example of that happened just last night. Yesterday, Newham Labour councillor Lewis Gordon Godfrey took to the site formerly known for its Little Blue Bird and accused the Newham Independent group of staging a protest by interrupting a 14-year-old boy playing the flute. This was an event being held at Queen's Market, and that said market were market traders, as you might have imagined. Unhappy market traders at that, though. Although 2 members of the Newham Independents were present at this event, they were not involved in any protest because the protest came from the market traders themselves. They aren't happy with Labour. They aren't happy with the Labour Council's decisions because the market is to undergo redevelopment they don't like. It's being mishandled, and they came out with placards. But if you were to take the word of Councillor Godfrey, this was all organised by those pesky former Labour councillors now calling themselves Newham Independents and members who are now their official opposition. Queen's Market faces demolition and regeneration, and it is widely being seen as an attempt to drive locals out. Instead of listening to that, the Labour councillor present decided to opportunistically attack the Newham Independents, who were just bystanders on this occasion. Godfrey knew this. There is footage of him taking pictures of it all. The interruption of the young flautist was simply traders standing, holding up messages about free parking and no development. He wasn't really interrupted as such. There was fallout afterwards, but again, it's between people unhappy at the Labour mayor's decisions and the officials present, nothing to do with the Newham Independents. But this, of course, followed on from the actions of the statutory deputy mayor of Newham, blocking the official Newham Independents page, thus stopping them from holding him to account on social media for what he might be doing there, what he might be saying there, as so many of us choose to hold our politicians to account, do we not? It isn't just MPs, it's local councillors too that take to Twitter and opine on what they're doing and get held to account for it if needs be, or indeed praised for it if they're doing good work. So many of us on social media do it all the time because it is a direct connection to our elected representatives. So to block before any real engagement can ever happen is a surefire sign they don't wish to be held to account, in which case, why enter politics at all? Well, I think we can all come up with answers to that one. But all elected representatives should want to be held accountable for their actions. We're all only human. Mistakes will happen. How you choose to respond to being held to account is the measure of how good a politician you can be, that you wish to be. But to cut that off from being publicly held to account shows this chap in question, James Asser, does not want to be scrutinised publicly at all, at least not by those who know everything he says and does with respect to representing the people of Newham. But you said this carries nationwide ramifications, Damo. We're still in Newham here, you might be thinking. But Councillor James Asser is probably better known, though better being a relative term in these things, for being on the Labour Party National Executive Committee, no less. Yes, this does go much further than Newham, because if this is how petulant Asser is locally, how might that be reflected nationally, when he has a seat at the highest table within the Labour Party itself? James Asser is on the Labour National Executive as the representative of all affiliated socialist societies. Now there's a contradiction, considering Keir Starmer regards socialism as a swear word and socialists as people to be purged. But then when you look at some of the affiliates, you can see they're using the word socialist as sheep's clothing hiding the wolf beneath. Such member societies include the Fabian Society or the Jewish Labour Movement, Labour Housing Group, Labour Business, Disability Labour, LGBT plus Labour and more. There are 20 groups currently affiliated, all told, that they all share one representative on the NEC is, I think, pretty poor. That person is James Asser, who doesn't like being held to account, it seems, or doesn't wish to engage whatsoever with opposition parties on Newham Council. Well, just seems to be a bit of a petulant person that doesn't bode well for how these groups might actually be represented. Do you want an even bigger laugh, though, folks? Asser is the NEC chair of the Equalities Committee. Yes, you couldn't make it up. He's got a hell of a job trying to win back all of those Muslim votes that Labour has burned with its pro-Israel anti-ceasefire stance. The recent by-election in Newham that saw Sophia Nakvi elected, having taken over half the Labour vote in Plaistow North, was said to have been won in the mosques, not on the doorstep. So as deputy mayor and a portfolio holder in Newham itself, as well as being chair of the Equalities Committee nationally for the Labour Party, you're doing a bang-up job, James. Is that why you blocked the Newham Independents? Did they embarrass you a little bit? Is their win seen as a sign of your own failure here? Your cheeks burning a little bit over the affair. It does make you wonder. I want an insight into where Asser is at politically, though. A Labour list article certainly showed his allegiances. This was when he was appointed to his role as that chair of the Equalities Committee on the NEC. This is an excerpt of the article, and which reads, Asser, the representative of 22, now 20, affiliated organisations on the party's ruling body, is considered to be a strong backer of the new leadership under Keir Starmer. He is a councillor and cabinet member in Newham. He tweeted, "Very honoured to be elected chair of the Labour NEC Equalities Committee. Thanks to all my colleagues for their trust and support. We've lots to do, but I'm looking forward to the challenge." His election was welcomed by the Jewish Labour Movement's Peter Mason, as well as NEC members Luke Akehurst and Anne Black, who described the meeting of the new Equalities Committee as constructive. So he's a Starmerite. He's pally with Luke Akehurst and has his supporters amongst the right-wing Jewish Labour movement. In my opinion, no wonder the Newham Independents worry him. They'll keep on showing him up. So if he wants to cover his eyes and block his ears on social media because he knows, because he won't be a person to change things around for the Labour Party, given he clearly does not want to listen or learn from where Labour went wrong, blatantly shown in Newham just last week, then the Newham Independents have every reason to believe they'll continue to go from strength to strength, and nationally nothing looks set to change here either. So if you want change, it is pretty pointless backing Labour at this point, isn't it? Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where the scale of Sophia Nakvi's victory the other day really does underline how bad things are for Labour locally in Newham. How much will this be reflected nationally with polling failing to reflect this still? We will have to wait and see. But Starmer and co will be foolish to think there wasn't a consequence, and there won't be consequences still. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer's ceasefire stances have proven he has more faces than a town clock, frankly, as yet again he is gaslighting us as to what he actually wants by way of peace in the Middle East. And the ongoing attacks by Israel on Gaza, and to my mind it shows that having been wrong-footed, with severe polling damage having been wrought amongst Muslim voters, this slight change of stance might just make this statement a bit of a begging letter to all of those Muslim voters Labour has lost over this genocide because of his pathetic posturing in relation to it. The only line on this he has stuck to is Israel's right to defend itself from people whose land they have been occupying for decades, and people know the history. the truth, and more eyes are being opened to that daily. But of course we've seen a 4-day ceasefire now, haven't we? This has now been extended by a further 2 days until Wednesday. And now Starmer, the man who said a ceasefire would embolden Hamas, the man who said humanitarian pauses where the killing could resume once aid had been sent in was better, now wants a longer ceasefire. Says more time is needed as it becomes abundantly obvious that actually Hamas can be negotiated with. Actually, they will obey a ceasefire. Actually, it's Israel that has broken that ceasefire multiple times, and the relief from being blown to bits means aid can still get in. News to the former human rights lawyer that people don't need to keep being killed after for that to happen. Well, naturally, he's been shredded for his naked opportunism once again, for being the man with more flip-flops than a beach hut. Right, so Keir Starmer, for it is he, yet again, embarrassing himself publicly by thinking we've all forgotten about his multiple different positions on the Israel-Gaza genocide that has been playing out for getting close to 2 months now. The man bought and paid for by the Israel lobby was always going to be backed into a corner over this matter. He can't afford to come out against Israel and on the side of Palestine, so he's moved on from the indefensible excuse that Israel has a right to defend itself, but actually international law was more on the side of Palestinians having the right as an occupied people to resist occupation. The only both sidesing in this matter is that innocent lives on both sides have been lost, and they must be condemned on both sides for that. Hamas certainly are guilty of some of that, but evidence is there that Israel are guilty of multiple war crimes, not just in Gaza, but against their own people as well. Starmer, of course, has now moved to a position of both sidesing this matter entirely. It's frankly as far as he dare go without upsetting his pro-Israeli paymasters in the lobby. But after weeks of backing Israel publicly, after threatening his MPs with a sack if they backed a ceasefire, resisting calls for a ceasefire not just because of the lobby, but because Labour foreign policy is being dictated by Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak, the fact a ceasefire was brokered thanks to the sterling efforts of Qatar, nothing to do with the US or the UK, Starmer has been forced to admit that actually the ceasefire he pointlessly lost 10 front benchers over, who resigned to rebel against his senseless stupidity, was the right idea after all. If only he learnt to listen to other people apart from Peter Mandelson. Not only that, though, but it is causing Labour severe electoral damage by Starmer, that Zionist without qualification, solidly living up to that title. Muslim voters have abandoned Labour in their droves, according to poll after poll, and the recent events I've been covering in Newham Borough Council and the rise of the Newham Independent group, which I've covered in recent content, can be, at least in part, directly attributed to that. However, he can't admit to being wrong. He'll just pretend it was always our position. It's what he always does. He sees admitting a mistake as a weakness, when not being able to do so is the biggest character flaw there is. Nonetheless, this is where he's gone, and worse for him, he felt the need to issue another statement along those lines, frankly doubling up as a begging letter to Muslim voters to boot as it did, in my opinion. It reads, "The cessation of hostilities, which has been in place since Friday, has delivered some relief after weeks of pain and suffering. However, more time is needed if we are to build on this progress. We have all been moved by the images of released hostages reuniting with their families, but many more remain captive, their families in agony. Hamas should release all remaining hostages now, and we must support every diplomatic effort to get them out as quickly as possible. The last few weeks have been an unimaginable nightmare for Palestinians. The civilian death toll, including women and children, has been far too high. We have seen improved access to aid, food, fuel and medicine in Gaza, yet more time is needed to ease the unnecessary and intolerable humanitarian catastrophe. There are also urgent repairs to the civilian infrastructure that need to happen so that aid can be distributed. Today's agreement to extend the cessation of hostilities shows further extensions are possible. Therefore, I call on all parties to build on this progress and work urgently towards a further extension. This will allow for the release of further hostages and deliver more humanitarian relief for those in desperate need. An extension would undoubtedly ease tensions in the region. Israel needs to be assured that Hamas cannot carry out an attack like October 7th ever again. Palestinians need to be assured that the future will not be like the past, and they and their children will be able to enjoy the opportunities and rights that we take for granted. As well as allowing more hostages out and more aid in, an extension of the cessation of hostilities would also allow more work on ensuring what follows the war is a political solution that ends further violence." He really is the most contemptible shit in politics. How dare you, of all people, say this? My blood was boiling as I was reading it, so permit me to shred this before I go any further. He talks of weeks of pain and suffering which this ceasefire, extended as it now is, has halted, yet if he had his way after a drink and something to eat, Palestinians can continue to be gunned down or blown up. Hamas should release all the hostages now, he says, as if They're the only ones holding them. For every hostage Israel released, which Starmer doesn't mention, Israel took captive just as many people over the weekend in the West Bank. Where's his criticism of that? Whoops, I forgot who bankrolls him, didn't I? We've been moved by images of people reuniting with families, but you'll be hard-pressed to find Palestinian families celebrating reunions as such, because the IDF went around warning them not to, or they'd be taken back into administrative detention in violation of the ceasefire. No mention of that either, eh, Keith? Aid is getting in, he said, not north of Gaza City, though, because just as civilians were shot at by the IDF when they tried to return north, aid trucks were as well, again in violation of the ceasefire. He admits the ceasefire is working and extensions are possible. That's the closest to an admission that he was wrong as you're going to get, but don't push him on it. He'll just pretend that was his position all along. Only Israel needs assurance that Hamas can't repeat what happened on October 7th, apparently, not the Israeli people in the kibbutzes who might appreciate reassurance that an Apache gunship won't show up again and cut them down as well, because the evidence is there that Hamas didn't kill all of those people on October the 7th, but again, no mention of that from Starmer. Let's skirt over that. Some of my donors might not like it. Further extensions would allow for a political solution. Well, how many politicians and media pundits have bleated that you can't negotiate with Hamas then? You can't negotiate with terrorists. Well, all peace at the end of war comes about the same way. Both sides talk. It was a stupid narrative, and I'm reminded of Piers Morgan and Jeremy Corbyn again on this as I wrote that, because nothing exemplifies the ignorance and dumbing down of people by our media more than Morgan gobbing off incessantly and stopping anyone else getting a word in, demanding that condemnation of Hamas again. No condemnation of collective punishment from Starmer, no overt blame for all the civilian deaths, even now. Starmer, I said he both sides things, didn't I? He didn't really at all. Even now he's backing Israel, really. If he hopes to win back Muslim voters by becoming pro-ceasefire, he's missed the boat. It's too late, and he doesn't go far enough anyway. And besides that, he's missed out all the important bits, as I indicated, that they will have been looking for him to say. A direct condemnation of Israel's actions, of Israel taking hostages, of Israel killing so many more people than Hamas did, of the destruction of Gazan infrastructure committed by the IDF. There's none of that there. I can actually see the Muslim vote share for Labour dropping even further, and it only sits at around 5% now, already down from some 76%. But I'm hardly the only person holding Starmer to account over this, because at time of writing, his statement, put out on Twitter, some 12 hours old-ish, as I was writing this, has been retweeted just 350 times. This is a guy that has 1.4 million followers. Though how many of them are real is another story. But it really does go to show how utterly unimpressed by this people are. Of those 350 retweets, though, some 150 of them are quote tweets. And none of them are Starmer friendly. Let's have a look at a couple of them, shall we? The Not the Andrew Marr Show Twitter account said, "How many days will you give the people of Gaza, Sir Keith?" Well, indeed, how much more of a cessation in hostilities, as Starmer put it, is enough, because he couldn't actually bring himself to say the word ceasefire. That would have been too on the nose, too obvious. He'd have been called out for that, and he can't be found to be wrong, can he? Navarra Media's Aaron Bastani wrote, "Complete opposition of what Labour's John Healey overtly said before the ceasefire. The most cynical person in British politics is Keir Starmer. His supporters would reply, quite understandably, that it's working. But can you carry on like that in government? I don't think." He's right. If Starmer thinks he's getting away with lying like he does now, he'll never manage it in power when his decisions dictate actual policy, and he wouldn't get away with it with so many more eyes on him then, his actions having consequences. Feature writer for the Morning Star, Richard Red Star, wrote, "But you didn't want a ceasefire and threatened your own MPs who did want to vote for one with the sack. You sat back while Israel were bombing and killing Palestinian women and children in revenge for the 7th of October. We see you for what you..." And that sums it up in one. That is exactly what Starmer has done and will do again, should hostilities resume. Key quote that I've seen that I'm going to finish with is from Linda Sale, who said, "It would have been better if you had said nothing rather than post this insult to Palestinian suffering." And that I 100% agree with. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content up daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where Starmer is turning being wrong into an Olympic sport, with Israel having broken this ceasefire already on multiple occasions and Hamas actually holding Israel to account for that. But he's learning nothing. Money from donors speaks louder to him than our votes do, apparently, as he loses more and more of them over this. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so a huge trade union scandal is emerging concerning Unite the Union right now. And what makes it so huge and so downright bonkers is the fact that trade union is being taken to court for discrimination, for being a bad employer itself. The scale of it shouldn't be underestimated either, as news just out reports that both the current General Secretary of the Unite Union, Sharon Graham, and the former General Secretary, Len McCluskey, are both being called to give evidence, being summoned to court, subpoenaed to give evidence personally in this case, because this goes to the very top. The person concerned who has been discriminated against has been done so under the very worst of circumstances, frankly, and the question everyone is asking is, why is such a huge story not getting reported in the mainstream media of the UK? This is one of the biggest trade unions in the country. Usually the right-wing press can't contain themselves from attacking trade unions, so why, when they've got what looks to be a justifiable source of criticism for one, are they ignoring it? Right, so a discrimination case against a bad employer is exactly what trade unions are supposed to be there for, aren't they? But what do you do if the trade union is itself the discriminator, the bad boss? Well, we're getting a lesson in that courtesy of a gentleman by the name of Brendan Ogle, who is taking his employer, who happened to be Unite the Union, to court, along with the current union boss, Sharon Graham, and an ally of hers called Tony Woodhouse, over defamation and breaches of the Employment Equality Act. And it's a pretty sickening story as to how we've got here, actually, which I covered some time ago in other videos, but which is worth a brief recap now at this point. Brendan Ogle is the most senior Unite figure in Ireland. Having had to take time off to deal with a cancer diagnosis, however, upon his return to work, he suddenly discovered the new regime run by Sharon Graham wanted him instead shuttled off to a lower position, a demotion some 100 miles away from where he was based, all despite being found fully fit to return to his previous role. If getting cancer is now a sackable offence, in effect, what does that say about the employer? What would a trade union do in response to such treatment of an employee by another business doing that? Well, they'd all be out on strike in a heartbeat, wouldn't they? I would sincerely hope they would be anyway. Unfortunately, when your trade union is your boss, it becomes a whole lot more messy. You can't underestimate how much this has damaged the union, because Ogle is very, very well regarded in Ireland, is widely seen as somebody who goes into workplace issues with a won't back down attitude, is known by name to many. How many trade union reps can you say that about? And upon the news of his mistreatment by the union, there were threats of disaffiliation from the union by sectoral branches, community branches. Graham's offices were protested outside of, and she even ended up delaying her own way overdue visit at that point to Dublin upon becoming General Secretary. Due to the hostile reception she was, well, fully aware she was going to receive when she got there. So why did Sharon Graham do this to Brendan Ogle then? Well, I dare say she'll have to answer that now in court, won't she? At tribunal, to the Workplace Relations Commission. And I'll be very interested in what she has to say. It seems a real shame the mainstream media are not, though. And isn't that unusual? They were falling all over themselves to attack unions during our summer of strikes, weren't they? From the railways to the NHS, the trade unions were to blame for everything going wrong. Delays to our jobs, can't get to work. Oh, it's the union's fault. Starmer's Labour refusing to join the pickets, the Tories were rolled out to attack the unions, to hilarious consequences all too often if they happened to be unlucky enough to be on a panel featuring the likes of Mick Lynch, whose body counter politicians, thanks to truth-laden caustic responses he had become infamous for in response to whatever drivel they happened to put out themselves. You didn't see much of Sharon Graham doing the rounds though, did you? Perhaps some trade union bosses are more of a target for our media than others, or are more willing to engage with them, much like our politicians, I suppose. His friendliness to the pro-establishment ones and the venom and holding to account is for those who threaten change from that established order. If Graham is the sort to sack people for getting ill, she's not exactly inviting establishment ire, and so presumably now that Red Len McCluskey is gone, the lefty, the socialist, the firebrand, Unite is in safer hands for them rather than for us. So this treatment of Brendan Ogle seems synonymous with how the union would treat any of us if we worked for them, and begs the question of how the union would act in the interests of members at this point as well, particularly in the likelihood of an incoming Starmer-led government, a person Sharon Graham is being viewed as becoming closer and closer to. If the most senior Unite official in the whole of Ireland isn't even safe from discrimination, how can any of us be? And when it is happening effectively on the quiet as the media ignore it, that question seems doubly relevant. Graham's reasons, until she chooses to tell us what they are a matter of conjecture. However, there's a few reasons why Graham might not be happy with Ogle. He didn't support her General Secretary campaign for one, which she doesn't like, but a more intrinsic reason is that Ogle was a whistleblower. He blew the whistle upon his return from cancer treatment, supposed protected disclosures, allowed to make them, shouldn't be able to be punished for them, and these were in connection to Unite's adherence to COVID protocols during the pandemic. So I doubt Graham will be admitting to this, but it is this that Ogle claims to be the reason for his dismissal, so questions will be heading Sharon Graham's way on this, I am very sure. At any rate, the legal action began yesterday in a suit that was expected to last for 8 days, but has now been adjourned until February, where Graham and McCluskey will give evidence. And speaking of evidence, seems to be every reason for Graham to be nervous, it would appear, given that she overlooked the union's retained law firm in this particular case, a firm called Turner Hamilton, in favour of using the far more expensive, self-proclaimed world's largest law firm, Dentons, a company which declares annual profits of some $3 billion a year. One Unite figure at the time that news came out back in September of this year said of that, Turners are Unite's solicitor in Dublin on every legal action and have been since ATGWU days. Now the management has gone over the head of their normal firm that they pay a retainer and who takes all member cases, and hired one of the most expensive legal firms worldwide to fund this case out of members' subs. So the firm that all Irish Unite members get allocated isn't good enough for Sharon Graham in this defamation suit. And for reference, the ATGWU became Unite all the way back in 2007. Sharon Graham, to my mind, has been running scared of this case for a while. Money from membership subs is no object, it seems, to protect herself. And if that doesn't give away her nervousness that she doesn't trust the legal expertise of those people ordinary members work with in their own employment cases and have done for years, I don't know what does. We have the boss of one of the UK and Ireland's largest trade unions potentially directly implicated, certainly being called to testify, and the mainstream media here in the UK, the same can't be said in Ireland, their papers and the like are covering this, seemingly don't see this as important enough to warrant a column or two. Maybe they think this is an Irish issue, but when Unite is a massive UK-wide union as well, how they conduct themselves in Ireland, no matter where it is in fact, should concern members in Ireland and the UK alike, surely. This matters to us here in the UK just as much as it does to people in Ireland, so why do the mass media here not seem to be able to see that? It's one of the biggest trade union scandals we've had in years. A trade union that is literally a bad employer, acting as a bad employer, allegedly. And it going all the way, allegedly, to the very top, and nobody's covering this. Nobody seems to want to know. Nobody thinks this is newsworthy. Well, that is utterly ridiculous that this is a case. And frankly, it justifies the reason for alternative media to exist, because if not for smaller outlets and foreign media, Irish in this case, so much wouldn't be learnt of. So support your local media, your independent and your alternative medias, and stick this story under the nose of those mainstream journalists who spend all their days opining on social media, and ask them why such a huge story is getting sat on by them. They can't possibly not know about it, in my view. Solidarity to Brendan and all supporting him right now. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where that announcement that Sharon Graham was switching to a very expensive global law firm for herself, well, that went down like a cup of cold cig, as I'm sure you can imagine, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the Labour Party, at local level at least, is continuing to crumble faster than an overdunked rich tea biscuit. As straight after losing 2 seats on Newham Borough Council last week, courtesy of a by-election pasting by the now official opposition there, Newham Independent group, and a defection from Labour to said group as well, last night's news broke of Labour losing control, majority control at any rate, of Norwich City Council, as no fewer than 4 councillors dramatically quit, as well as a Norfolk County councillor, now all sitting as independents. Today, this morning, another Norfolk County councillor has quit as well, bringing the total to 6. So, will there be any more? Oh, we'll have to wait and see. What's triggering it this time, though? Well, to likely no surprise to regular watchers of this channel, the answer ultimately goes back to Keir Starmer. But actually, on this occasion, it might not, at least not entirely, be down to the brill-creamed one's position on ceasefires and his attitude towards Israel and Gaza. Right, so another council collapsing out of Labour's control then, is it, Damo? Yes, well, certainly less under their control than it was before, as now 4 Norwich City Councillors and 2 Norfolk County Councillors have quit the Labour Party in one fell swoop, leaving Labour running a minority-controlled council as things stand as I write this. Labour are down to 19 councillors on the City Council, leaving them now 2 short of a majority versus 13 Green councillors, 3 Lib Dems and the now 4 Independents. Labour could struggle to get key votes passed now as a result of this. And this is the 3rd council in as many weeks that Labour have lost control of, following Oxford City Council, where they retain minority control as they do here in Norwich, but they lost control of Burnley Borough Council completely, with 9 councillors and 11 councillors respectively having resigned. So why has this latest group then gone? Well, the circumstances of the 4 city councillors, one of whom was a former parliamentary candidate incidentally, resigning, apparently arises from a full council meeting, which is the biggest meeting of the month for a council, the monthly meeting which all councillors have to attend, where the 4 resigned after apparently the public were removed. And this is usually because confidential matters requiring discussion come up in the agenda, and that usually is done at the end of the session so people can go home and the councillors remain and deal with this bit of business. But it's alleged the police had to be called too. I've heard no detail as to why that would have been, if indeed it did happen. And I'm also a little bit puzzled as to the reasons why the matter was done with the public not present, this question that was asked. But the crux of the matter is that apparently they acted following the council refusing to answer a question brought by the Green Party group calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. That is the one reason I have seen being passed around for the resignations, or it's one reason. However, it certainly isn't the only one. And certainly it isn't the narrative shock horror that the BBC have picked up on. BBC East, as it happens, so the local Beeb in the area, are reporting it is actually more of that good old-fashioned Starmer factional interference in selection processes that have triggered this, having spoken to at least one of the resigning councillors. The claim is that, as we have seen in so many places up and down the country, Starmer only wants people selected to stand for Labour that he's already had a say in. But in this case, it was down to apparent interference to stop one of the current serving Labour councillors on the City Council from standing again. It's not dissimilar to what is being done to Jeremy Corbyn within the Labour Party, just on a much more local level. The candidate in question, a chap called Ian Stutely, represents Town Close Ward on Norwich City Council, and the other Labour councillors who resigned also represent Town Close Ward, so they work very closely together, with the exception of one who is represents in another ward. So this was a show of solidarity for their Labour colleague. Why take this drastic course of action, though? Well, it was the only course of action left to them because they'd already lost the fight over this. By refusing to back another candidate than their colleague previously, this group of councillors, these Town Close councillors, London Labour, the dictatorship that it seems to be these days, did what it is done so often in so many other places and just imposed their candidate against the wishes of the local representatives, who have now, as a result, all quit. Add to that 2 Labour councillors on Norfolk County Council too, and that reduces the Labour representation on that council to just 10, putting Labour now behind the Lib Dems on that very much Tory-run council. But one of the city councillors, the BBC don't name which one, said, "The atmosphere had become toxic. I hadn't been sleeping properly. It had reached a point where you've got to do something to help yourself. That's why I had to leave. Our values haven't changed. We still believe that local government is a force for good, and we intend to focus relentlessly on local issues, but as independent." The 2 county councillors, one of whom was the deputy leader of the Labour group, are also now going to sit as independents. And the one who was resigned just this morning, Maxine Webb, said in relation to what had happened to Ian Stutely, "The involvement in that process of Labour colleagues with whom I work closely and need to be able to trust has made my position representing Wensum as a Labour councillor unmanageable." The implication of that being the trust between Labour councillors here is gone, not just on Norwich City Council, but also Norfolk County Council to some extent as well. You just don't know who is saying what or doing what behind people's backs, is the impression I'm given. Ian Stutely is now going to stand as an independent after all of this. Yet again, what we have here is another totally avoidable mess caused by a Labour faction calling the shots who don't accept democracy unless it delivers the results that they want to see. They didn't want one particular councillor to stand for them again on a city council. They decided to impose a candidate they did like, and they've ended up losing 4 city councillors along with control of the council and 2 county councillors over it. Is it worth it? How can it possibly be? It's not in the interest of local people, only in the interest of having all the control and all the power wrested away from rotten lefties by a small cabal of petty dictators, both locally and in London Labour. A bunch of red Tories who are happy to lose, it seems, as long as they preside over the ashes. They've got local elections coming up here in May in Norwich. What an absolute car crash London Labour have left the local party in because of this. If you thought Starmerite factionalism and all these goings on and carryings on had gone quiet, it's just been continuing behind the scenes. It's just fallen down the news agenda somewhat. It's only when decent people stand up for what they believe in, though, that it gets noticed again at the moment. It gets picked up. And you have to realise what they are throwing away here, because Labour have been the dominant force on Norwich City Council for over a decade now. They held their majority on that council since 2012. They were winning every ward bar one, right up to as recently as 2018. And now, under Starmer, they're in minority control territory. Not in the slightest bit serving Norwich City at all, with their internal party squabbling, their power hunger, and the public are never impressed by that. Will they get punished at the ballot box next year? They certainly deserve to. We won't have that long to find out. Labour NEC member Jess Barnard, incidentally, formerly served on Norfolk County Council herself, and she's hailed the former Deputy Labour leader, Emma Corlett she's called, a former nurse as she is incidentally, as a mentor to her and a massive loss to the Labour Party. But they don't care, I'm afraid. The statement issued by all the councillors concerned was that there are many reasons, but in essence, we no longer consider the current national and local Labour Party matches the overriding principles that guide our work. Solidarity to a principled group of local politicians who have seen the sad reality that their party no longer has any. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where half that Burnley Labour group quit following calls for Starmer to resign over his disgusting Gaza ceasefire stance. Not that they got a dignified response in any way to that. Likely didn't really expect one either. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so more allegations of vote rigging in Labour parliamentary selection votes came out last night, following on from those allegations still dogging Croydon East and the selections there, which I covered in another video, blaming heavily, as they are, the online Anonyvoter voting system that Labour uses. This time, the seat in question is Beckenham and Penge, a brand new seat taking in a chunk of the Greater London seats of Beckenham and Lewisham Western Penge. So you can just smell London Labour all over this one once again, and also Anonyvoter again too as a consequence. As a result, we saw a Palestinian Aid charity CEO defeated by just 8 votes, and this was apparently down to a glut of online and postal votes coming in at the last minute for another candidate, a certain Liam Conlon, whose name to most people won't be familiar at all. But his mother is a lot better known, since his mum happens to be Keir Starmer's relatively brand new Chief of Staff and author of the Gray Report into Partygate, Sue Gray. A Labour staffer close to Starmer, and her son just happens to get the required votes at the last minute. Come off it. Right, so nepotism wins the day again then. Is it, Damo, you might be thinking? And well, you wouldn't be alone on thinking that, along with a non-voter facing accusations of having delivered the desired result once more to Team Keith, as Sue Gray's son, Liam Conlon, wins the selection for the, due to boundary changes, brand new seat of Beckenham and Penge. And being a brand new seat within the bounds of Greater London, the more and more suspiciously regarded London Labour has oversight for such processes. It certainly doesn't help that London Labour's Twitter account has gushingly put out a post saying, "Congratulations to Liam Conlon, who has been selected as our Labour candidate for Beckenham and Penge." Will right-wing Boris Johnson supporters who blame Gray for doing in their man and whose departure from the civil service to join Starmer's team cry foul over this? Well, just a bare shit in the woods, I would say. But their ire, misplaced in this case in my opinion, isn't really the story here, because the real story is another parliamentary candidate selection going to a favoured candidate, who is the son of one of Starmer's most senior staff. So it's quite easy to see how they would be a favoured candidate. It just screams of favours being done. Making this one even worse, though, is that the narrowly defeated candidate just happens to be the CEO of a Palestinian Aid charity working out there right now in Gaza. The optics for Labour, even if there were no additional suspicion of vote rigging in this instance, are absolutely appalling just because of that. Starmer has consistently backed Israel, backed them committing war crimes even, though he just denies it. We heard him say it on LBC. That will never go away. He has threatened sackings over those who back a ceasefire, and now a ceasefire is proving to be working. It's been extended further, making the hope that it will become permanent all the greater. Shows him having got all the big calls wrong, even though he denies ever having got anything wrong, as he always does. So the rejection of a Palestinian rights advocate standing as a Labour MP, becoming a Labour MP, just smacks of being an obstacle to his ongoing Zionism without qualification having been removed. The last thing we need is more fawning sycophants to Starmer, more yes men for him should he become Prime Minister. Yet, conveniently, that is what has now been laid before him now. The defeated shortlisted candidate here by 8 very convenient last-minute online and postal votes was one Melanie Ward, who is the CEO of Medical Aid for Palestinians, MAP or MAP, and has been since January of this year. Her background before this was working for the International Rescue Committee, which means she was at one point working for David Miliband. Hardly a rotten lefty, you can imagine in which case. But her experience on the ground has also included work in Lebanon and in the occupied Palestinian territories of Hebron and Yanoun. She's also been an advocate for Action Aid and Christian Aid, so a wealth of experience from the charity and humanitarian sector. She knows the situation in Palestine, knew it well before recent events as well, as she said upon taking up her post in January that it's a huge privilege to be appointed the next CEO of Medical Aid for Palestinians. Having lived in Hebron and worked in Lebanon, I have seen up close the grim reality of occupation and displacement for Palestinians and the need to build a better future. MAP is a unique and special organisation whose dedicated staff and partners, with the backing of committed supporters, do extraordinary work in extremely difficult circumstances. This work is to ensure that all Palestinians can access quality healthcare and, more than this, it is also about dignity, solidarity and justice. With the death and injury caused by successive Israeli bombardments of Gaza on top of already problematic child malnutrition levels, a growing mental health crisis, economic catastrophe in Lebanon and the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, MAP's work is needed more than ever. The ongoing harassment of Palestinian NGOs in the West Bank highlights the importance of MAP's focus on supporting and strengthening Palestinian organisations. I'm really looking forward to getting started into leading this brilliant organisation in its next chapter. Frankly, you read that and you can imagine Starmer wouldn't want to be within a country mile of someone with that kind of first-hand knowledge of the plight of Palestinians, even before the most recent genocide. As I said, that was back in January she said that. But it shouldn't be up to Starmer. He shouldn't have any influence or say in who local people choose. And yet, as has been observed, once more we turn to Michael Crick's Tomorrow's MP's Twitter account, which follow all parliamentary selections, and questions get asked and eyebrows get raised. There were two key quotes, two tweets from Crick in relation to this matter that are, I think, very salient. Crick said, Liam Conlon, son of Sue Gray, has beaten Melanie Ward, CEO of Medical Aid for Palestinians, by 8 votes to become Labour candidate. I hear Conlon did really well amongst postal and online votes. Just kind of leaves it hanging in the air there a little bit, doesn't he? And he also went on to say, sources seem to be in agreement that Melanie Ward won the meeting with a strong performance on the night, but couldn't overcome Conlon's strong lead on postal and online votes. So we have another situation where online ballots and postal votes made the difference, a very, very narrow difference. And given the level of interference we've seen from London Labour, especially in selections, in multiple cases, it's enough for people to cry foul. The replies to Crick's first tweet above bear some of that opinion out. Sharon wrote, that doesn't sound right. After all we're seeing right now and the support Palestine has, why would somebody nobody knows beat the CEO of Medical Aid for Palestine? Spiral Unbound wrote, compared to the other candidates, he seems to have so much less experience. Interesting choice, Labour. Education campaigner Shippo wrote, postal and online votes? Well, I'll go to the foot of my stairs. And Bolshalev put, is that the now totally discredited online voting system you previously mentioned, Michael? Corrupt. And of course, in light of the Croydon East right now, which is the Croydon East situation, which is what Michael Crick also previously went on about, that was Bolshalev's point, with an Anonyvoter firmly being blamed for candidate selection fallout there, which I covered the other day, another video, and which Crick seemed markedly more angry about actually than this particular result, oddly enough. So what of Conlon himself then? The fact he is Partygate reporter, author Sue Gray's son smacks of nepotism in the ranks, as I've said, but does he actually have any credentials for this job? Any talent, any experience that makes him a good choice? It does seem only fair to have a look and check, doesn't it? Well, he's a former Labour disabilities officer. He had an accident in his youth that left him unable to walk for several years. So he did recover from that. But should he be elected as an MP, therefore, I, as a former Labour disability officer myself, will be very interested to see if he advocates strongly in favour of disabled people and their needs, and the way they're being treated and have been treated under years of Tory rule, and who seem to be in Rachel Reeves's firing line as much as they are the Tories. He's also former chair of the Labour Party Irish Society, so perhaps he might be able to educate Starmer on the, finer points of the Good Friday Agreement, which he doesn't appear to understand, given past comments relating to Brexit and the Tories' Windsor Framework Agreement. If this is a rigged selection, though, and I don't think those suddenly appearing postal votes and online votes make it reasonable to suspect that, with everything we've seen Labour doing, certainly over the last 12 months easily, especially when the dominant candidate appears to be vocally pro-Palestine at that, then any hope he might stand up for disabilities or Northern Ireland in Parliament may be misplaced, but I suppose we'll have to see what happens and see if he ends up winning that seat after all. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful, though. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily as ever. Please do have your say in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation on that story in Croydon Heath. Go and have a look at it, because it's the carbon copy really of what's happened here, but people are far, far angrier there. Local members are up in arms. Not so sure that has been quite the reception in this instance in Beckenham and Penge, but perhaps it should be. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so last night the Tories' Data Protection and Digital Information Bill passed its third reading and has now been passed on to the House of Lords. But not before the nasty party snuck in a last-minute extra bit of nastiness to force all banks to monitor the accounts of benefit claimants looking for suspected fraud. I can only assume it's too much to ask that they do this for offshore accounts of the rich in the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands, of course, but no. They're going to make the banks do broad checks on benefit claimants instead, in a bid to save, apparently, £500 million over 5 years. Here's a thought. How about you do this to Michelle Moan's bank account instead, or ask Dido Harding where that £37 billion in test and trace cash went? This is yet another culture war, yet more persecution for people already struggling in their daily lives with their help, now not knowing if Big Brother is rifling through their finances too. Right, so, as if the disabled, the long-term sick, the out of work don't have enough on their plates right now, as the Tories look set to find them fit for work come what may, or die in the process, somehow they're managing to become even crueler in their plans outlined in the autumn statement, because now they'll be spying on your bank accounts too. Worse, there was no objection to it. Normally when you see one of these votes happening in Parliament, the Speaker or Deputy Speaker asks for the ayes to the right and the noes to the left, and when the noes are loud enough, they call division, and MPs trundle off to vote, don't they? Well, there was no division regarding this extra clause. The ayes had it, the ayes had it. There was a later division vote on the schedule for bank spying, not the clause the Tories snuck in, and even then just 52 MPs voted against it. Just 7 of those were Labour. Most of them were SNP. Starmer, in customary style, sat on his hands over this, sat on the fence, arse full of splinters, as per usual. The allegation, the justification for this rule, is that the number of benefit claimants has gone up since the pandemic. So we're talking all those people left with long COVID or associated other health issues because of government incompetence, let's face it, as the obvious target of this move, combined with Hunt's horrible move to toughen up sanctions even further, to the point of stripping people of their right to access free healthcare, legal aid and more. They allege that with more claimants come more fraud, completely ignoring the fact as ever that benefit fraud is basically negligible, whilst tax fraud is many, many, many times greater. Those people might be Tory donors though, or potentially Labour ones these days, since they basically nodded this through by providing no opposition to it. Now the claims made by the government on this are very simple. Oh, we're definitely just looking for the fraudsters, you understand. We're looking for those with more than £16,000 in savings, which would mean people are no longer entitled to certain means-tested benefits, or we're looking for those who spend too long overseas and lose their entitlement. That would certainly justify the government including the disability benefit personal independence payment in their plans, because That benefit is not means tested. It is absolutely irrelevant what your income is. If you claim that, it is all about how much support you need in your daily life to get up and get on because of disability or long-term ill health. But you lose entitlement to it if you spend more than 104 weeks out of the last 156 out of the country. And you also lose entitlement, temporarily at least, if you're in hospital for a prolonged period, more than a month, I believe it is. Now, it strikes me that this is going to apply to very few claimants all in all, a fraction of PIP claimants, because, let's face it, most people who are on benefits in this regard, they're not well off enough to go swanning off abroad for long periods of time, and they certainly don't have more than £16,000 rattling around in their bank accounts. A few will. So why make this a focus, really? Has to be another reason. There's always another reason when it comes to the Tories. You've always got to dig down to find out what they're really up to, what they're really after. The Tories know, as they have for the last 13 years, that you get the benefit bill down by kicking genuine claimants off their claims. That's why the process for claiming PIP, or Employment and Support Allowance, ESA, or Universal Credit, particularly the disability elements, so hard. And indeed why they insist on reviewing these people when, for a lot of them, they will never get better. They have lifelong disabilities and illnesses. So what do you reckon is the real reason behind this then, Damo, I hear you ask? Well, I'm so glad you asked, because Jeremy Hunt's plans to force everyone to look for some form of work, even working from home if you are long-term sick or disabled, has one exemption. And that is if the ill or disabled claimant of universal credit or the equivalent legacy benefit is also in receipt of PIP. Therefore, really, this is about finding people on PIP who they can try and kick off PIP, who they can then try and force into work. They can't do it based on earnings. PIP is not means tested, though there was talk not long ago of reviewing that. That isn't on the table at this moment in time, though. Maybe in a future Tory manifesto. I wouldn't rule it out. But with PIP being the gateway benefit, I can see those claimants being eyeballed for definite. If you aren't on PIP, expect to be coerced into work. So the government might well expect more claims for PIP to go in. That'll be fun, won't it? The DWP has a massive staffing crisis right now. It's currently operating almost a year behind with PIP claims and renewals, yet again. So even if people try to claim it, with this banking spy game due to begin apparently before the end of the year, they'll be fighting not only to claim PIP, because that in and of itself is a swine, but battling against delays in doing so too, as they face losing other entitlements because they simply are not fit for work. It's a royal mess in the making, but the Tories, they don't really care. This is vote fodder for the right wing, isn't it? General election coming up not too long, won't there? How will the banks implement this so fast as well? All the work, all the emphasis of this is being put on them to do this, isn't it? This job is being legislated upon them as things stand. How quickly can they do this? Will they need to recruit more staff to do so? Is it in their interest to do so, or are they going to argue the toss with the government instead? Especially with the DWP wanting them to check accounts monthly too. This is blatantly an invasion of privacy. When the same isn't being done to tackle tax fraud, which is a much greater issue, they are as ever targeting the wrong place for sofa change in effect, rather than recouping meaningful large sums of money. Apparently it will involve lots of trained specialists to review bank accounts as well, but when that comes from a Tory, and considering we're talking about benefits here, I'm reminded of all those not at all well-trained benefit assessors out there who screw up on a regular basis and mess up people's lives, and I ask myself, how likely is it these people can not only be trained, but be put in place and begin the work within weeks and keep up with it? We're nearly in December. Not only is this an invasion of privacy, though, but it is a declaration by the Tories and Labour for not standing up for them, that disabled people and the long-term sick are to be automatically treated as criminals, along with their carers, of course, who gave up work to look after them and for whom Jeremy Hunt has announced nothing in the way of support, as his plans for their charges start getting off the ground. What happened to innocent unless proven guilty? Now, everyone who happens to be long-term sick or disabled is guilty unless found innocent. With a benefit system still two-tiered as it is right now, the government still have not got universal credit universally rolled out, of course, bearing in mind they said it would all be done getting on for 7 years ago now. That regularly still gets screwed up for people who can least afford it. For a demographic of whom hundreds of thousands of people have died due to how the Tories have for years mishandled the matter of the incomes and finances of the long-term sick and disabled. How anyone can have any faith in this being administered properly and so quickly is beyond me. It's for the birds. That the opposition mostly sat on their hands as it progressed through the Commons and now on to the Lords. It's not law yet. The Lords could still, have a fiddle, have a tinker, have a say, should serve as a reminder that Starmer's lot are absolutely no different. And with his Chancellor Rachel Reeves being most famous for saying, we'll be tougher on benefits than the Tories, there's little hope that things will change with them in charge instead. Guilty unless proven innocent. Invasions of privacy. Banks made to do a job that isn't really their business to do. Benefits will now have an extra layer of being screwed up by the Tories. It's just pitting deserving poor against undeserving poor. And people shouldn't be taken in by it and should be disgusted by those introducing it. We've seen enough damage and fallout under the benefit system by now that we should all be wise to this by now. Planning it as well as those sitting on the fence and watching it happen. Refusing to stand up for those with additional needs as Labour are. The Tories and Labour truly are two cheeks of the same arse here. So if this disgusts you as much as it does me, don't vote for either of them. Do disabled people and long-term sick people a big favour. Don't vote for either of them. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where I went into the details of Hunt's latest plans further earlier this month when he brought out his autumn statement, adding a little bit more context to the cruelty being exposed that he's seeking to inflict. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Israel has unfortunately resumed hostilities this morning, blaming Hamas for doing so. Hardly breaking news that they blame Hamas, as they never admit to doing anything wrong themselves, of course. But depending on what media outlet you're reading or watching, you'll be given varying reasons for why Israel have done this, all basically blaming Hamas. But both Israel and Hamas agreed to a further ceasefire extension just yesterday, so what changed? Some sources talk of an attack in East Jerusalem, others a rocket attack by Hamas on Israel, others talk about a refusal to release more hostages. So what exactly has happened here? And whose version of events can we trust on this? Right, so the Israel-Gaza ceasefire has sadly ended. If Keir Starmer's currently running around with a grin on his face squealing, "I told you so," it wouldn't be surprising at all to me. But he's still wrong, because our ceasefire is still the only route to a lasting peace and an end to the conflict. He hadn't made the call to make it permanent, just to hope that it would last a bit longer, and then a bit longer, and so it is now over, at least for now. Resumption of hostilities is absolutely a setback here, but diplomacy remains the only way out of this, and the same calls made before that brought about a week of peace need to be made again, so we get a much more long-lasting one, hopefully a permanent one. So why have Israel gone on the attack again then? Oh, well, it's Hamas's fault. The terrorists have fired their tin can rockets at us again, so now we're back to firing back our state-of-the-art US and UK made arsenal at them. There are a few reasons being mainstreamed right now as to the cause of the collapse of the ceasefire, all of whom seem to be peddling the official line being given by the IDF, because they never lie, do they? Honestly, after all the debunkings of the propaganda they've been spewing out in recent weeks, how any supposed journalist worth their salt can type their words, what they say, as some form of factual evidence without blushing, I don't know. But this is what mainstream sources are saying. In this case, Sky News, the narrative being set that Hamas broke the truce, despite Israel having broken the ceasefire agreement on multiple occasions, actually, and Hamas, not choosing to abandon the peace effort, have instead been holding Israel to account. The other day, the ceasefire got extended because Hamas refused to release a batch of hostages until Israel stepped back into line, they having not released women and children they themselves have been holding based on how long they've been held for, as they were supposed to, as per the agreement, and also for sending the IDF around to their families, the families of these said hostages, threatening them if they dared celebrate publicly the return of their loved ones. So there is little reason why the Hamas authorities in Gaza would breach the ceasefire agreement, it would seem, when they've been the ones holding Israel to it. Yet, of course, the IDF is saying that Hamas are the ones that violated the operational pause and fired towards Israeli territory. Now, as always seems to be the case, we've seen no evidence of this, but who knows, perhaps this time they'll produce some. On the other hand, another incident outside of Gaza, this time in the West Bank, would it seems give Israel cause to call Hamas out at least. A shooting in East Jerusalem at a bus stop killing 3 Israelis and injuring 13 has been reported by The Guardian, which a Hamas group have claimed credit for, the Al-Qassam brigades, who, being Hamas, are based in Gaza, but who do operate cells in the West Bank, apparently. Were they operating under the orders of the Hamas government in Gaza, though? Well, potentially. You can't say no, you can't rule that out until we know otherwise. You see, Israel haven't just been releasing hostages in Gaza, it has to be noted, because for as many as they've released, they've been taking more in the West Bank. In the 7 days that this ceasefire has lasted for, Israel have released 240 hostages, including Ahed Tamimi, who infamously punched the face of an IDF soldier in 2017, which made her an overnight phenomenon and a symbol of the resistance against the occupation. But at the same time they'd released those 240, they had arrested and taken 260 more Palestinians in the West Bank, meaning they now have more Palestinian hostages after the ceasefire than they did before. Now, if that isn't a massive violation of the ceasefire agreement, a complete and utter lack of desire being shown by them to truly engage in a peace process, then I really don't know what does. All of the hostages released were either being held without charge or for the crime of resisting occupation, which of course is their right to do under international law. Not one of the people Israel was holding was a criminal. To me, it is a flagrant attempt to incite Hamas by repeatedly breaching the ceasefire agreement or not meeting the terms of it in good faith, as we saw here. Perhaps the Al-Qassam brigade attack was directed by Hamas, perhaps it wasn't. It's very hard to tell when these cells very often act independently. I just find it hard to believe, after holding Israel to account on more than one occasion over the last week, that they fall for what I would consider baiting them. Of course, all these possible reasons for the resumption of Israeli hostilities and blame being put on Hamas is coming from media outlets everyone should, especially in this matter, take with a pinch of salt. So let's go and see what one with a better reputation, that has been more reputable on this issue, had to say. Al Jazeera is the Qatari-based media outlet that has been covering much of this story far more factually and honestly, not least because Qatar was the country who actually got this ceasefire in place to begin with. Has simply stated in its coverage of the return to Israel bombing Gaza that the ceasefire had simply ended. The extension to the ceasefire being reported on just yesterday, not ultimately being successful. The deadline therefore then passed and Israel were there bombing again dead on 7 a.m. or 5 a.m. or here in the UK. So at time of writing, they've been at it again for some 5 hours, and reports already of some 30 Palestinians having been killed have already come in. They report on what the IDF have said as well, but also what Netanyahu himself has been saying. The reason things fell through was a Hamas decision to not release more hostages, according to him. I would argue, since you were taking more hostages as you were releasing others, they've got every reason to accuse you of infringing on the truce. But Hamas have not yet, at time of writing at least, formally responded to the cessation of the ceasefire. What we do know is where Israel are hitting, or planning to hit, because reports have come in that since attacks on Gaza have resumed this morning, that the IDF are hitting all parts of Gaza. Remember that they sent people to southern Gaza to be safe. They drove them out of northern Gaza, encouraged them to leave. Safe being a relative term, of course, when they targeted convoys of people evacuating to the south, and they have struck southern targets already. Well, now Israel are ordering Gazans to evacuate in the south as well now. Well, where are they going to go then? Leaflet drops in the southern towns of Bani Sahila and Karara in the south of Gaza, near the southeastern border of the Gaza Strip with Israel, are being told to evacuate now as well. Where to? So are people now, having been driven south, now being driven west towards the sea? This isn't what from the river to the sea is supposed to mean, but you can imagine Zionists getting a sick kick out of this kind of a metaphor if this is actually the plan and this is actually what they're doing now. Israel has not acted in good faith throughout this week-long ceasefire agreement. The West didn't condemn that. Hamas held off hostage releases when they broke it, and most media ignored that. Netanyahu now cites that as a reason apparently showing Hamas breaking the ceasefire agreement, which is nonsense. Israel simply isn't used to Hamas being able to look them in the eye on their level and hold them to account directly. Frankly, they pretty much stand alone in that, since everyone else seems to fall over backwards for Israel as they play the victim card over and over. Now Israel is targeting not just the north of Gaza, which they've already laid waste to, but also central Gaza, and now southeastern Gaza is on their hit list. The majority of Gazan people who have already fled south, some 1.8 million of them now, already displaced, now being forced westwards. Israel, by their actions this morning and through the ceasefire, have shown themselves to not be acting in good faith. And if that goes for some in Hamas too, then I condemn them equally too. But by Israeli actions now in the south, and with further warning to evacuate happening there too, Israel, to my mind, have no intent on letting up in their genocide and their ethnic cleansing. They're just ramping it up. If Western powers were committed to peace, they'd have been roasting Israel over this. Instead, last night, Starmeroid drone Steve Reed on Question Time spoke of the West being vindicated. Ceasefire ending this morning says you're wrong, Steve. Well, anyway, he said, Israel's right to defend itself cannot mean a blank cheque. That has been extended for a number of days so far. In that space, there is the opportunity for more conversation on both sides and pressure from the outside world to stop it. Now, I think there's a vindication in this, of the position taken by President Biden and others in the Western world, who did not say to Israel, you do not have the right to defend yourself, which is what some have said. By getting Israel's ear, they have listened, and there has been this pause. What we need to do now is seize that pause and use that moment to extend it for as long as we possibly can. Well, within 12 hours of you recording that, Steve, on QT, it was over. Nothing has changed in Western narratives whatsoever, and hailing the position of Genocide Joe, of all people, to being vindicated when he's supplying most of the military aid, when we have likely been shipping it to Israel via our RAF base on Cyprus, and that somehow being the reason this ceasefire happened, that's vindication. Your brains are in your arse, man, and at any rate, the ceasefire came about, as aforementioned, because of Qatar. Nothing to do with Biden. The West has been nothing but its usual unhelpful, interfering, pro-Israel self. It's likely only involved anyway because, oh look, oil and gas off the coast of Gaza. And you talk vindication. I'm sure your vindication will come as quite the comfort for the families of the 30 Palestinians already dead at time of writing as the attacks resume, and you still talk of Israel being able to defend itself when it is literally bombing occupied territory. There is no two-state solution in Israel's mind here, not without adequate external pressure and calling out what it is doing to force it in that direction. Because that is blatantly not just self-defense what they're doing now, and they won't back down over it without pressure. This is the value of BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions. This is how apartheid was ended in South Africa, as Israel extend their attack range. Calls for that should be louder than ever for that to be stopped. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content up daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where a pro-settler paper, a leaked Ministry of Intelligence document, spelt out Israel's plans for Gaza, going back years. We're seeing it being enacted right here and right now. So we can't say we aren't being warned and haven't been warned. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so let's get December month off to a good start, shall we, with a little bit of a good news story, a little bit of positivity, because Keir Starmer's had his backside handed to him in his own backyard by the Green Party, no less. This should serve as a warning for him, but I doubt he'll take heed somehow. Politics at local level has been dominated for weeks, frankly, by stories of Labour resignations and defections and by-election losses, and in no small part is that due to the position of Keir Starmer with respect to the situation in Gaza right now and the atrocities being committed by Israel following a Hamas attack, which to all except the most hardened Zionists is seen as massively disproportionate to the point of being a genocide and an example of ethnic cleansing. Any attempt to impose sanctions upon which has seen the UN Security Council get vetoed time after time by the US. But for all the claims I and others have made that things may not be looking as rosy electorally for Starmer, particularly, and the rest of his sorry bunch, as national polling might suggest, these matches are dismissed as being irrelevant because local election results, well, we keep getting told they're not a good analogy for national results, don't we? And although true, some of the scale of the losses and where they are happening in staunch Labour strongholds makes me think people are being a little bit foolish to dismiss such things completely out of hand. But now we've had a result in Starmer's own constituency, a by-election on Camden Borough Council, the result of which should worry him significantly if this is how his own constituents feel about the party he now leads, and of course the power they have directly over him come a general election. Right, so it's local council by-election time again. I do hope you're not getting fed up with me doing these videos because I think they are very, very relevant with regards to the standing of Labour electorally versus how they're polling. Although this one was a little bit different because this one wasn't a Labour defence. This wasn't something Labour were trying to protect. This was a Green Party defence. And this was triggered by the departure of Sean Berry, the former Green Party leader, as she is now running to replace the retiring Caroline Lucas in Brighton Pavilion, heading to Parliament, and therefore she didn't feel she could continue to meet the needs of her constituents on Camden Borough Council in Highgate Ward, and so she vacated it. And having been lost to the Greens by Labour previously, quite some time ago, and has always been held by them just by the skin of their teeth. There's always been a very narrow lead. This was expected to once again be another tough defence for them. Labour really wanted this seat back so that Highgate Ward would once again be 100% Labour, something it hasn't been since 2002. The ward also having 2 Labour councillors currently, and there's 3 councillors on the ward all told. But things did not go that way for them again. What you have to realise first here is how tight the race was previously when this seat was last contested. Let's have a look at the most recent one, because it wasn't that long ago. Camden Borough Council had its last set of local elections only last year. So we're only, 18 months in, and Sean Berry topped the vote for Highgate Ward with 1,967 votes on a 49% turnout. Local elections always traditionally a bit lower than a general. The Labour candidate also elected to the ward, who came second, was just 69 votes behind her. The Labour candidate, who didn't quite make the cut, coming fourth, because of course there's 3 seats available, was still only 440 votes behind Berry. So you can see how narrowly she got elected to the council, how tight things were at the top there. So the Greens expected a fight here. They expected this to be tight, and Deputy Green Party leader and London Assembly member Zach Polanski made this clear in a tweet he put out a few days before polls opened, saying, "Really exciting. This seat is in Keir Starmer's constituency, and as I've been knocking on doors, it's so close between Labour and the Green Party. If you want to help elect Lorna as our next Green councillor and can help on Thursday in Camden, no experience necessary, sign up below." Lorna being Lorna Jane Russell, the candidate in question for the Green Party here, formerly on Camden Borough Council representing Fortune, but actually before that was a Labour councillor there and Deputy Mayor of Camden Council even. She actually ditched the chance to become the next Mayor of Camden Borough Council when she defected to the Greens in 2021, so we're under Starmer's tenure here, and she did so warning that Labour was not listening enough to residents before making decisions. We've heard that a few times now, haven't we? But at any rate, there was expectation management here regardless. But as it turns out, the result was so not even remotely close, it surprised the Green Party themselves. Turnout was down from last year. They're never high in local elections anyway, but it was down from 49% to 33% for this by-election. That was the turnout this time around. And Lorna Jane Russell didn't just hold the seat. She took 59% of the vote, which was a swing of 14% to the Greens. I'll remind you, this is Keir Starmer's constituency. Standing against her were Labour, who lost 13.4% of their vote share on just 29%, so the Greens absolutely annihilated them, getting over twice as many votes as Labour did, with the remainder going to a Tory and a Lib Dem, who got 9% and 3% respectively. Now Labour are playing expectation management here as well. They are citing that they hadn't held all 3 seats in Highgate for 20 years, and that this result doesn't surprise them, and that the Greens kept hold of it. But that is a little bit of an excuse. You see, Sian Berry had been a Camden councillor since she was first elected to Highgate in 2014, though the Greens had held a seat in this ward going back to 2006, when 2 Greens and a Tory actually wiped Labour out completely in Highgate Ward. That's Tony Blair for you. Even then, though, the Greens only scraped in by 81 votes. Highgate has remained a close call. Even under the Highgate by-election in 2008, which notably the Greens also won, they only did so by just shy of 300 votes. You've got to bear in mind at this time, Labour were actually in power. They were in government. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Lorna Jane Russell just beat Labour by over 770 votes, and the Labour candidate only got 740 votes all told. So Labour excuses, they're not washing. And where Labour got wiped out in Highgate previously, back in 2006, Labour were in government. They were in power. And that's usually the reason they lose councillors in local elections, isn't it? It's the party that's in power. People don't like what they're doing in power, these neoliberal Thatcherite parties, and so they lose votes and lose seats. But Starmer is still in opposition, and he's already built up that level of disdain and disgust at local election level. But not only that, he's done so in his own constituency. These are his own constituents that this is happening with. Never before have I seen Labour voters either turn away from Labour or just stay at home whilst they're in opposition because they want to send a message to them. And given these are the people who will see Keir, Rodney, Starmer on their ballot papers at next year's likely general election, if they are the stay-at-home type, if they are the I'll take my vote elsewhere type, perhaps to the Greens, disgusted with what the man is doing, they could quite conceivably see him lose his seat if they so desire it, despite Starmer's huge majority. A majority in the 30,000 vote region at the moment. A majority that was far, far more modest before Jeremy Corbyn became leader, incidentally. And even more so if they choose to vote against him or split the vote, denying him his seat and therefore his chance to walk into number 10. I would argue their votes are going to be amongst the most important cast in the country next year if Labour are on course to form the next government, because one with him in charge of it doesn't bear thinking about, and they've got the power to make sure that he's not able to do that. Will he heed the warnings here, though? Probably not. Too arrogant. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where Labour have been complaining about the Green Party publishing how they voted, or rather didn't vote at all, in relation to a certain ceasefire vote recently. Well, if you don't want your constituents complaining to you about how you vote, maybe you should vote how they want you to. You are supposed to represent them. That is why you are elected, after all. Perhaps you need reminding of that a little bit. And I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Henry Kissinger is dead, and I was always taught to not speak ill of the dead, but in this case, it's frankly all good and decent people have, given how many people this despicable human being sent to their graves early, making it all the more perverse that he himself should reach the grand old age of 100. Well past his sell-by date in the opinions of many. And while many people are opining on the man's track record, a short one in government actually, some might be surprised to hear, but one marked by so much death and tragedy that it might perhaps not surprise everyone here in the UK that he was considered something of an idol to a certain Tony Blair. Kissinger in many ways being the blueprint for the sort of politician Tony Blair went on to be. But if you think Kissinger's influence on Labour stopped there, you would unfortunately be very wrong, as his ties to Keir Starmer have also been well documented, and we can see that relationship and that influence being borne out in what Starmer is doing in the here and now, and what he himself might take into government. Right, so this is a little bit of a longer vid. I was toying with making two videos out of this, covering the connections between Henry Kissinger and Tony Blair, and then Henry Kissinger and Keir Starmer, but actually everything is so intertwined it proved a little bit difficult to do that, so I hope you're going to bear with me and see this slightly longer video through. It will be worth it, I hope. Anyway, Henry Kissinger is dead. For many people, even with just a passing familiarity with the man's gross deeds when part of the US administration, he is regarded as a mass murderer by a lot of people. But it's possible it hadn't registered with some people the sad news of several other deaths on the same day. Shane McGowan of the Pogues, Dean Sullivan from Brookside, even perhaps former Chancellor Alistair Darling, he of the infamous black eyebrows. That might have meant you might have missed Kissinger's passing. A spiritualist type might perhaps think Kissinger had to take a few more down with him as he went, but let me just give you a brief overview of what this man did before we get on to his influence of Labour leaders later on, in case you think I'm being overly caustic, because actually I think I'm being rather restrained. Henry Kissinger's legacy, aside from in our current and former Labour Party, is that he made a lot of money, he held a lot of power, and he killed a lot of people. He was insanely clever, but was not a decent man with it. That's a horrible combination in power. In some ways, it is a relief he was only in the White House for 8 years, 2 US terms, serving under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, where he was a national security advisor under the former and US Secretary of State under the latter. But his influence has lived on through what he did in US foreign policy whilst he was there, and again, still, through politicians today, including here in the UK. Kissinger will be remembered for his interventions in foreign wars and the results of his actions more than anything else. Take the Yom Kippur War of 1973, where Israel came under attack by both Egypt and Syria, along with other Arab states, seeking to take back occupied territory. Sound familiar? Since in 1967, not only did Israel occupy the Palestinian states of Gaza and the West Bank, but they also seized at that point the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Now, the US had been supplying Israel with military aid since the 1960s. If you wonder why they won't intervene over the occupation of Palestine now, it's probably because they helped Palestine get occupied to begin with. And Kissinger, again siding with Israel and with US help, they prevailed in the end, hanging on to their occupied territories. He turned the tide of that conflict which Israel was losing by throwing as much armament to Israel as he could. Then there was the Vietnam War. People will credit him with ending that, but that would overlook the incident of him also dropping thousands of bombs on Vietnamese people on Christmas Day in 1973, same year as Yom Kippur. In Cambodia, the US had been carpet bombing the place right up until that conflict ended, also in 1973. It was a busy year for Kissinger. And Kissinger is on record as saying in 1969, with regards to commentary that the bombing in Cambodia was excessive, that we would rather err on the side of doing too much. He also personally supervised the bombing runs there. At this point, some 500,000 Cambodians were already dead. Most people aware of Kissinger's record think of Cambodia as the worst, but that is mainly because the so-called secret war in Laos, the Laotian Civil War, is far less well covered. Laos, of all places in the world, this might surprise you to know this, holds the unfortunate record as being the most bombed country per capita in global history, with the US under Kissinger dropping more bombs on Laos than Germany and Japan combined during World War II. 260 million bombs dropped on Laos. To this day, the people of Laos make peace doves out of unexploded ordnance that they find that from time to time still comes up. If it was a civil war, why was the US involved though, you might be thinking? Well, that's why it gets called the secret war, because they had no business there. And basically because the American people had no idea it was ever happening. To this day, somebody in Laos is blown up by unexploded devices. The war ended in 1975, by the way, every 2 weeks. Hence why they make doves from the bits they find. That's Kissinger's legacy. Every one of those little doves you might see floating around in the world, a little bit of Henry Kissinger in it. There's even more than that. I never even got onto the coups that he led, where he deposed leaders in Argentina or Chile, and even wanted to engage with white supremacist governments in southern Africa. Yes, South Africa indeed. I've gone on long enough here on Kissinger himself. I think my point is made. But let's bring up this to Kissinger's relationships with Blair and Starmer now, though, because this is the point of the video after all, and I'm going to start with Starmer. There's a reason for that, which I'll come on to. But Keir Starmer, as a lot of people are aware of these days, was a member of the Trilateral Commission, a group started by Chase Bank founder David Rockefeller, and Starmer joined at some point in either 2017 or 2018. We don't actually know for sure, because Starmer refuses to talk about it, and he also refused to disclose the fact he had ever joined them to begin with during the tenure of then Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, or tell any of his team. And this was spelt out later by then Corbyn spokesman James Schneider, who said on this matter, Starmer didn't inform us that he was joining the Trilateral Commission while serving in the shadow cabinet. If he had, we would have put a stop to it, like we did when he tried to take an inappropriate outside job with city law firm Mishcon de Rea whilst shadow Brexit secretary. Membership of the Trilateral Commission, a body dedicated to promoting corporate power, was plainly incompatible with Labour's then stated policies of redistributing wealth and power from the few to the many. Can't argue with that. The Trilateral Commission are anti-democracy. They feel there is too much of it. They are very much pro-capitalism. It's notable that only one other MP has ever been a member, and that was Tory MP Rory Stewart, who left around 2016. Now the Liberals' hero is, of course, as he is, such is the extent the Tories are tilting rightwards in their politics over the last several years, terrified of losing ground first to UKIP and now to Reform UK. But it just goes to show only a right-winger would actually want anything to do with an organisation with beliefs such as that. And it should put to bed any foolish notion that Starmer will pivot leftwards in power. He is a Tory. At any rate, Starmer was on the Trilateral Commission at the same time as Henry Kissinger. Starmer only having resigned from the Trilateral Commission himself, presumably because he got found out, and that's only happened in the last year or so. Kissinger himself has only now left the Commission by virtue of dying, because he wasn't just any old member, he was a lifetime trustee of the Trilateral Commission. Now let's take a look at Tony Blair's relationship with Henry Kissinger. Immediately you can point to the million dead Iraqis at the hands of Blair and Bush and see echoes of Kissinger there. But even more so when you read how Blair eulogised Kissinger, actually idolised him. Here's what he said of Kissinger. Do try your best to keep your last meal down. He said, "There is no one like Henry Kissinger. If it is possible for diplomacy at its highest level to be a form of art, Henry was an artist. I consider it one of the greatest privileges of my political life to have known him. From that first moment of meeting him to the last, he inspired me and taught me, and I will be forever grateful to him." Vomit-inducing stuff. Yes, Iraq sees exactly what kind of artistry Kissinger taught you by way of diplomacy, didn't he? His version using bombs instead of talking. To call Kissinger an artist reflects the heights of ignorance and the depths of depravity, but that's Blair all over. 1 million dead Iraqis for Blair, but Kissinger oversaw the deaths of millions. The man dodged The Hague, and I sincerely hope Blair still gets his day there one day. Starmer, bear in mind, considers himself to be Blair on steroids, so do keep that one in mind. Also bear in mind, Blair was joined at the hip to George W. Bush, bringing about the Iraq War. We can't just blame Blair for that. So it is worth mentioning that John Negroponte, Bush's Director of National Intelligence, and 2 former members of the US National Intelligence Council, Joseph Nye Jr. and Richard Cooper, were also on the Trilateral Commission with Kissinger and Starmer. There are many more rabbit holes you can go down with all the connections between these 3 men, Kissinger, Starmer and Blair, so please do take a look at Declassified UK to read more in depth on this, because all of this is related to what we're seeing here and now. Would it surprise you to learn, though, that Keir Starmer is attempting to build connections to Benjamin Netanyahu now? Probably not if you think like me and lean the same way politically, but as many of you will be aware, upon leaving UK politics, Blair, without a trace of irony, went on to become a Middle East peace envoy from 2007 to 2015. It sickened so many people to their cores, but the rancid man has a habit of landing on his feet. But during his time in that role, and previously as Prime Minister of course, he built up extensive contacts in the Middle East, and that includes Netanyahu and his hangers-on. Blair even still holds an office in Tel Aviv. He's been on a schmooze fest for Starmer, telling the Israeli government that he's not Jeremy Corbyn, because of course Corbyn is ardently pro-Palestine, and that under Starmer, should he get into power, should he become our next Prime Minister, Israel can expect a consistent approach. That's how it's been described. In other words, as I've said in so many other videos, nothing is going to change under Starmer. That goes for the UK's relationship with Israel too. I would suggest even more sycophantic in all likelihood under Starmer than it is now. Blair's intervention here is not in any official capacity, of course, yes, it's another one of those rare interventions of Blair, but his advice on this has apparently been sought. So this is Starmer, almost certainly, I would suggest, with Mandelson's involvement as well, getting Blair involved to reassure Israel that the UK will still back them under a future Labour government. If you're wondering at this point if Netanyahu and Henry Kissinger knew each other, then wonder no more. Netanyahu praising him following his death as a great statesman, scholar and friend. Here's a nice pic of the two of them just last September gone. All very cosy, isn't it? So we have a situation where Henry Kissinger is connected to Starmer, Blair, Netanyahu, the Bush administration, the Trilateral Commission, even actually the US administration of Joe Biden. Because all of that foreign policy of theirs that Sunak and Starmer are both following on from loyally, having been crafted by current Secretary of State Antony Blinken, refusing to change tack unless the US does. The US have resisted a ceasefire until Qatar outplayed them and got one in place themselves, albeit just for 1 week. Well, you might not at all be surprised if you've watched this video so far to learn that Antony Blinken is a current Trilateral Commission member as well. This is the legacy of Henry Kissinger. Diplomacy by death and destruction, and he's seen as a hero by leaders across the Western world. Think about why so many wouldn't call for a ceasefire now, instead favouring temporary humanitarian pauses. Anyone taking a leaf out of his book shouldn't be allowed anywhere near power. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Do have your say on this story in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where the current ceasefire has ended between Israel and Gaza, but the reasons behind this, according to Israel, are really very, very pathetic. Truly worthy of Kissinger himself, actually. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.